Love it. And you did 6 different iterations.
Yep.
You started off in HR and you've ended up somewhere else.
So we actually, HR was sort of like in the late middle. So let me just quickly walk you through the iterations. The very first thing we built was an automated to-do list that looked across all your tools and tried to identify things that you'd forgotten. So you would connect your Slack, your Figma, your GitHub, your Google Docs, your Gmail, your Calendly, whatever tools you use. And then we would give you this little digest of here are things you might have forgotten to do. There's this comment in Slack you forgot to reply to. There's this new Figma mock that your designer just published that you should look at. There's a GitHub pull request that's been open for 3 days that you haven't looked at yet. Go look at that. And by the way, I still think some of these ideas are good. The problem we had with that idea was it was really, really hard to communicate the value, and it took too long to see the value. So our pitch to users was basically like, hey, Colin, give me access to all of your most sensitive internal tools. And then someday I may do something useful for you, but I can't actually really predict when I will give you that value or what exactly that value will look like. And so that was and we just had we actually got some users who liked it, including ourselves. Like, we could just tell the friction in communicating it and getting it out there was way too high. That was a product feature that was a product concept that was way better suited to an existing incumbent that already had the data access and the user relationship.
Or if you took that a lot more niche and said for a very specific vertical.
Exactly. I could have said if you are, an outbound SDR and people have replied to this sequence in this way, you should do this. Maybe we could have done that better. But our mindset was always in this very horizontal realm at the time. So we did not niche down at that time.
Fair enough.
The second thing we tried was a stand-up tool. And so we had looked at this sort of digest idea of things that you needed to do. And we're what are people already doing today where they kind of summarize all the things that they're doing across their tools and they bring it to other people's attention. And there's this ritual that many teams have of a daily stand-up or a bi-weekly stand-up. And sometimes it's async and sometimes it's sync. And this was in the heart of the pandemic. So everyone had moved from the traditional stand-up where you're all standing around your desks to something like an async stand-up in Slack. And so we built a tool called Smart Stand-Up that would basically automatically write your stand-up update for you.
Yeah.
And it would say, you wrote these emails, you wrote these documents, you made these mocks, and then you could edit it.
YouTube for 30 minutes.
Yeah. You could, of course, edit it and curate it before you send it out to your team. And that one we actually launched on Product Hunt. We got a few teams using it and really loving it. And again, I think it was a good product and a good idea. Actually, for some of the members of our team, it was the favorite thing they worked on in that period. Mm-hmm. But again, it just felt like I couldn't clearly enough communicate the value of it. I couldn't easily see how I would get it to a team. It kind of reminded me of some of the challenges I'd had distributing previous, spinach type time management assistive tools where it's is it really solving a burning pain point for people that they have to write their own stand-up update?
Yeah.
It was much more of a vitamin than a painkiller to use that lingo. And so then after Smart Stand-Up, we built, and I'm skipping a few that totally didn't work. We built a contextual knowledge base where we found, okay, so stand-up, it has the nice property that it has this habit that people do every day, but it's really narrow. You have to work in a super specific way. It's not a process that many people care about or think is important. You're not going to interact with it very much. But then we ran into this other problem where people were looking for information in an asynchronous, knowledge base, in their Notion workspace or Confluence or whatever. And everyone who's worked at a large company knows that stuff is always stale. You can never actually find real answers. And so we thought what if we could make this knowledge base more contextually relevant and live updating? So let's say you were navigating to a page that I had written 3 years ago. It would say, Jacob wrote this page. It was 3 years ago. He hasn't touched it since. It's probably out of date, but here are 3 more recent pages that have kind of some content overlap that you may want to check out. And by the way, Jacob still works at the company, so you can just ping him on Slack and ask him your question directly. And so we launched that. And again, we had this, the classic horizontal productivity tool problem of how do you get someone to install it? How do you communicate the value quickly enough? And that's when we found
from Confluence.
Yeah. And that's when we found okay, let's find one specific use case where people need a specific set of knowledge, presented to them in a curated way. And that's when we stumbled across new employee onboarding. And this is funny. It was at the time when everyone was hiring like crazy. So and everyone was trying to ramp up their teams in a fully remote environment, and new hires had no idea what to do. And it was a big pain point at the time. So we thought we'll build a new employee onboarding tool that automatically creates a getting started guide for every new employee. So many good managers, they'll create a detailed getting started guide where it's like, here's your mission, here's the people you need to meet, here's the documents you need to read, here's the groups you need to be in, here's the Slack channels you need to be in. And these documents, if done well, are actually really, really useful. And so we thought, let's see how good of a job we can building a getting started guide automatically. And so we did that. We tested it with about 20 hiring managers. We found that it was useful, but that a hiring manager would never pay for it or never even retain it, because how often does a typical hiring manager hire? Once a quarter? Let's say you're growing like crazy. A hiring manager might hire a couple people a month. It's just not a frequent enough pain point. And if they're hiring that frequently, they probably have a template document with 90% overlapping content and they just reuse it. And so we found that wasn't the pain point. But through that, we got connected to HR teams, and they said, we actually do have a pain point around new employee onboarding. And that is the entire workflow from coordinating the interviews to getting the offer accepted, to getting the NDA signed in DocuSign, to getting the offer signed in DocuSign, to getting IT to provision the right accounts, to getting the manager to create the guide, to sending the new hire welcome email, because it's actually quite a complex process, which might have dozens or hundreds of steps across multiple stakeholders. Some of them can be automated, and some of them need a human. So then we built the HR-focused employee onboarding workflow product. And we built a design partner program for that at the worst possible time in May 2022. So in April, if you remember the detailed timing of this, like in April 2022, is when the market in tech started to turn dramatically, and everyone immediately froze hiring in May 2022. So we had signed up 20 design partners in April 2022, and by May 2022, 3 of them were still hiring at all and like had any need for the product. But we went through the design partner program with them, and they actually really liked it. Like it was solving a real pain point for them. It was doing something they couldn't do in any of their existing HR tools. It was doing something they couldn't do with Notion or with Zapier or with any other tool. And so, okay, like we're on to something here. We're on to something here more than we've been on to something before. Like it was definitely felt like the best idea we had tried yet, in the sense that it was the easiest to communicate. It was the most burning pain point. We knew exactly who was going to buy it and for what reason. But then I just had this like moment of panic, which was, I am not the right founder to build an HR tech company. Like I think founder market fit is really, really important. Like I think I'm the right founder to build a horizontal productivity tool. I am not an HR expert. Like Laszlo Bach, the former head of people at Google, he went and built an HR tech company. That makes perfect sense. He's the right guy to do that. Like I'm not the right person to build an HR tech company. And everything I had heard was like selling top down to HR is super hard. They don't have a lot of budget. They're unfortunately, like in many organizations, like last in the pecking order. They already have used almost all of their budget for an ATS and an HRIS. So they don't have room for your like little workflow tool. And so I then had this sort of like, again, intuition, moment of introspection. I was like, we're definitely onto something useful here, in that there are workflows that people have to do over and over again that need some automation that maybe a tool like Zapier could provide, but they also need some collaborative task management like a tool like Asana could provide. And so that's when we basically took the leap and said, like, that's what we're building. We're going to call it Relay. And then we eventually called it relay.app to disambiguate from other relays. But the idea was it's a relay race where like the computer does some stuff, the human does some stuff, another human does some stuff, another computer does some stuff. And we thought there are going to be way more use cases than just HR onboarding that have that structure.